Welcome, everybody. My name is Tom Devine. I'm with SiouxperCon Online, and today I am moderating this really fun panel. As you can see, I have some amazing guests with me here that you can see on screen with me. But we are excited to bring you a bunch of cool panels throughout this whole SiouxperCon weekend, and we really hope that you guys are logging in, seeing everything that's going on. We appreciate you logging into this one and checking out. We want to hear from you, so please, it is an interactive medium. This is the internet. We want to hear your opinions. They'll go into the void. Some will be read, some will be discarded. But anyway, we will, before further ado, as I said, my name's Tom Devine. I'm with a Comic Book Look and SiouxperCon. I've normally ran the video game room for the last 3 years of SiouxperCon. This year it's a little different. We don't have a video game room. We're all online, as you can see. We're coming in from our own locations here. So I'm helping out, and I get the opportunity to interview and talk to some really cool creators here. And so SiouxperCon is doing a lot to bring these creators from all over the country to talk right now to you. So without further ado, let's hear who these creators are and what they're all about. So if you guys want to start off, let's start off with you, John. If you want to introduce yourself, kind of give us a little bit of a background of who you are and what your relation to horror comics is in the horror comics panel.
Okay, my name is John Bivens. I am a comic creator and an educator based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. Occasionally teach for MCAD and then teach for another college here called Dakota County Tech. I'm also one of the core members of World Monster HQ, which is a local comic book studio with Xander Cannon, Peter Wortman, and about 12 other people all shoved in there. Not right now because of pandemic, but, you know, usually a bunch of us all there together. My connection, or my way into comics is, you can kind of see behind me, the first project I ever did is actually Comic Book Tattoo, which is right here. That's kind of how I got into comics. Eventually I started working my way through. I even worked with the guy down there, Russell, a little bit in the past. We had a book together, Old Wounds. But eventually I found that I was like, the stuff I liked drawing was more horror genre based and sci-fi based. And so I started aiming in that direction with the work I was doing. And I start doing books like Dark Engine right here from Image Comics was my first Image book I did, which is very much a cosmic horror style book, mixed with a little bit of Howard Conan-y kind of stuff. Then I worked on Spread with Justin Jordan. I did 3 trade paperbacks with him. And that is very much like John Carpenter's The Thing meets Lone Wolf and Cub. I have Little Charlie, which is sort of like humor and horror mix, which is my own thing I wrote and drew myself. And then what you can actually pick up in comic book stores right now is Cult Classic Creature Feature, written by Eliot Rahal, who is also another SiouxperCon person that will be showing up eventually. And this is very much my love of 80s horror. And we even had a synth soundtrack made for it by local band Drift Click here. And so you can always go
cool.
and yep.
That's awesome.
And
so you can always go and get that.
But I got to pick that up, but I didn't pick up that tape. I mean, I'm missing out.
That's right. You can find it, I believe, on SoundCloud and Bandcamp, but the tape was a limited release thing. We had a big Halloween party last year, and they played, and they had these for sale there. So had to get that. And if you went to SiouxperCon last year, you'll probably recognize this. This is the cover to issue 2 of Cult Classic. It was also on the cover of the SiouxperCon book last year. So that's what kind of brought me into it. Currently, I'm doing a historic horror piece with Sebastian Girner called Devil's Red Bride, which will also be coming out through Vault Comics.
Ooh, that sounds really cool.
Let's see. I think that kind of brings me to present.
Yeah, no, that sounds good, John. I mean, you got a lot going on. I mean, clearly a man of some really high quality books, and it's we're really lucky to have you on. So I appreciate you showing up and to talk a little bit about horror comics. So all right, well, Russell, you're next up. So let me hear you. Who, I guess you're Russell. Spoiler alert, we have your name on the screen. But beyond that, give us a little rundown. Who are you? How'd you get into comics, and up until where you are right now?
Cool. Well, Tom, thanks a lot for having me. Excited to be part of SiouxperCon this year. I am Russell Lissau, and for the last 15 years, I've been a comic book writer working with artists such as these two fine gentlemen. I've worked with both John and Mark on a number of projects. I broke into comics in 2005 on Batman. I was the lead writer on a book called Batman Allies, Secret Files and Origins 2005. And that led to being one of the regular writers on a book called The Batman Strikes, which I was very, very proud of. I loved writing all ages Batman stories. And when I was done with that, when DC canceled The Batman Strikes, I began exploring indie comics and really discovered that I love writing horror. I've always been a horror fan, both in comics and in other media. I think I was raised on Stephen King, and then graduated to Clive Barker eventually, and started working on a variety of horror short stories, including the lead story in an awesome book called Kagemono, which was the first zombie story that I wrote too. Later, I did a zombie story with Mark called Survival that I'm very, very proud of. Mark and I have also done.
Mark, quick! That was great work, Mark. There it is.
On. Mark and I have done 2 other horror comics together, including the sci-fi horror thriller Terror Firma and the Devil Comes to Dinner story Dinner at Dante's.
Oh, cool!
And these are all illustrated by Mark. I love horror. I love being scared, whether it's in literature or in movies or in comics. I think, like both of the gentlemen here, I prefer suspense over guts and gore. I want to be haunted by stories. I don't necessarily just want to be grossed out. The slasher movies don't do anything for me. I want to be scared. I want to be haunted by a piece. And those are the kinds of stories that I try to write too. I've also done a lot of crime fiction, and that's what I'm working on now. Is just a book that my next book will come out this fall, and it's a 5-issue miniseries that we're calling The Hard Ways, and it's a kidnap story that takes place in Las Vegas, and that'll be published online first, and then eventually collected into a trade paperback.
Very cool. That sounds exciting. I mean, I love crime. I love you're a guy after my own heart right there. Horror and crime, those are like two of the best, right?
It's my bread and butter, man.
Yeah, that's excellent. Well, welcome, Russell. I really appreciate you joining us. That sounds so cool. You have so many cool books, and everybody on here, make sure you guys are taking the time, checking out these books that they've mentioned, fill in those spots in your long box. So let's bring it over to Mark. Mark, give me the rundown. Who are you?
Well, my name's Mark Stegbauer, obviously, as seen by the little tiny note that's on there. I'm currently based out of Madison, Wisconsin. So, the three of us have now got the tri-state covered. Between we have the I-90 corridor, set here, and so my foray into comics was I kind of began, roundabout working as an assistant for a lot of inkers here in like Milwaukee, Madison, Minneapolis, which led me to working at Marvel on Nova. It's on the poster right behind me here. My kind of foray into horror comics was kind of weird and roundabout because I mostly was doing a lot of superhero stuff. So I had ended up creating a all ages kind of monster hunter, which was called Dr. Goyle back in like '99 with Mike Norton, who created Battle Pug and has done a lot of work at DC. And it was kind of a comedic version of Hellboy. It was like if you took the Hellboy and the Tick and kind of put them together, that's what Dr. Goyle would pretty much be. Nice. And, so we did a couple, like a one shot, and then I brought the character back a few years ago and did a little mini series and didn't really do much more with it. In the meantime, I kind of started doing a little more horror stuff. I did all the illustrations for a book called The Do-It-Yourself Guide to Surviving the Zombie Apocalypse. And I had that put out. And then after meeting Russell, after the book came out, met Russell at a con, we kind of started talking, and we thought, hey, we should start working together. And that's where we started doing Survival, which was our first thing together, which was a lot of fun. So, I mean, after drawing all these, different zombies in the zombie, survival guide, drawing an actual zombie story was really cool. It allowed my, vast knowledge of my visits to Costco to work for me, as I was able to draw a warehouse store by memory, which was great.
Great.
And as Russell said, we've worked on a couple other horror books. Another thing I'm working on right now is a book with Steve Bryant, an all ages kind of book called Ghoul Scouts, which is a story about a group of kids who end up saving their town from paranormal activity, which occurs quite often because they live in the paranormal capital of the world. So the first volume had them fight a zombie outbreak in their town. The second volume, which we did, they end up going away to summer camp over Labor Day weekend and battling a werewolf. And we currently have a third volume that I'm working on and should be hopefully finished out to release early next year, tentatively titled UFOMG. So we got that going on, and I'm also going to be bringing back Dr. Goyle as a web comic on my Patreon page starting next month. So
excellent. And so they just look name up for on your Patreon?
Yeah, it'll be there for things I'm going to be doing. I think right now my plan is to do 2 pages a week, and they're just going to be like little self-contained 8-page stories of just weird, goofy stuff. Of you'll have to see it to believe what's going on. There's a lot of really oddball stuff. It's very much my love of just, I think, Tex Avery cartoons and a little bit of horror in there. But I think my whole thing with horror was as a kid watching, like the Universal classics and, of course, the Godzilla movies. That was kind of my whole, doorway into horror. And I'm a lot like Russell, where I like, a lot of the more suspenseful stuff. But I like the old kind of real good classic monster and horror stuff. I mean, the whole Hammer, Dracula stuff and all those movies are just, fantastic. So that's kind of my whole love of horror right there.
Yeah, and I mean, and you're currently writing or drawn a horror book. So yeah, that I mean, thank you so much for joining us, Mark. I mean, look at this. We have 3 heavy hitters here, guys. I'm sure we are going to all hear everything we want to hear about the ins and outs of not only making comics, but of the genre of horror and how they relate to comic books and just of all of our lives. I mean, like you mentioned, Universal Monsters, right? I have always loved the Universal Monsters, and I feel like since the old school Universal Monsters of like the 30s, that 39 Dracula and Frankenstein, I mean, that's when it was so good. I feel like Universal still, they can't seem to put their finger on the pulse and give us some good Universal monster movies up till this day. You'd think that would be the biggest franchise of their lives, but it seems like they fumble it after every time they try it. So yeah, that breaking into movies, and Russell mentioned Stephen King, and we're talking about all sorts of different horror. And as you guys talked about, it's all about storytelling, right? That is where it comes from. We are guys who like comic books. You clearly like movies. The visual storytelling aspect of comics is what draws me in every time, and I enjoy how comics can set up a vibe, a feeling through inking, through colors, through all sorts of things that you can convey without a big budget, without having to figure out where the actors are, or having to find a production or a set. You get to set that all up yourself. But it takes it one step further than the Stephen King book of it all being in our mind. So that is why I myself love horror comics, and it's great to have you guys talk about that. So as we talk about comics, we talk about storytelling. What is it about horror in general that kind of got you in? And then what type of horror, as you talk about that, what is the type of horror that you were drawn to? And and then eventually, how did that relate into some of your comic book work? Mark, I know you just were up, but if you want to track us off, I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Sure. I mean, I think for me, horror, I mean, as far as like in comics, this right here was my gateway for comic stuff. I mean, I mean, this one I had when I was a kid, and I just actually got this issue again this last week, and I've been filling up. I was like, going like, I need to get all these dang Tomb of Draculas. I mean, so I've been doing that. But this particular issue was kind of my first thing of like, oh, there's horror comics, and seeing this was like, just was staggering. But I think for me, this comic, I mean, the Tomb of Dracula that Marvel put out during the 70s and then right into early 80s, really, I think set the bar high for comic and the genre of horror, just because, I mean, there are a lot of other horror comics that had come out during the 50s. You had all those, the EC stuff, and you had, all the different books that were coming out. But I think that book for me, Tomb of Dracula, and just the work that Marv Wolfman and Gene Colan and Tom Palmer did, just raised the bar so high. And I think even today, comic, people who do like comic, horror comics specifically, I think can look at that comic and go, yeah, if I can get to that, then I've made it, because I think that really is the top bar as far as, horror comics. And I look at a lot of these. I've been looking at so many of these issues lately and just looking and just going, wow, I mean, just the mood that they were able to set in that book was just insane.
I think that's so cool that you bring that up as your first one, Mark. I mean, it really is a foundation of horror comics, and the amazing characters. Blade came out of that, and that are still kicking around the Marvel U today. But yeah, I mean, you're right. That is a solid foundation of what horror comics and something to strive to.
And you can't go wrong when it says on here, it says Comic Dump's #1 fear magazine. It's like they knew what they were talking about. They were like, "Oh, yep, that's us."
Exactly. Oh yeah, no, I mean that's exactly great. So, are there any other things besides comics that maybe kind of got you into horror before you were reading Tomb of Dracula? Did you see any TV or read any books?
I didn't really read any books. For me, it was always about more like the superheroes, and also too as a kid, I actually didn't like being scared all that much. I kind of liked, if I was in a movie, I could say it's like, okay, it's make believe. For me, I never really liked being scared. But, I think seeing the comic, I was more interested in really looking at the art and, and then the story more was secondary. And now as I'm older, it's like looking at both, equally and seeing the story with the art and, doing that. And it really is, I think, more of my respect for the genre is being able to kind of see the art and the storyline. I'd love to probably try and read. I mean, I've never read a Stephen King book. I've seen enough movies, but I mean, I probably should get to reading one of those books with these just to kind of get a feel for his writing, so to speak. So I know I'm like kind of behind the times there. So I'll get to it eventually.
Right? I mean, enough people have read him. You don't need to read him as well. So
yeah.
He needs that $10. Come on.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's like he's like, Daddy needs a 10 to be able to burn these hundreds, kids.
That's right.
No, so I think that's a really cool perspective where you were afraid of horror, afraid of being scared, into drawing comics that potentially are scaring people. So that's a cool transition forward. And how about you, Russell? Give us a little breakdown on your history, where you got into comics. I mean, into horror. You did mention Stephen King and reading books.
I always liked the escapism of horror comics and suspense comics, and horror as a storytelling genre. I think the very first horror book I would have read was Stephen King's The Stand. I'm pretty sure that The Stand was the first horror book that I read, and that just led me to his entire catalog, and that would have been maybe middle school or very early high school. Just the escapism of it, that, you know, these fantastical stories that had a horror tinge to them. It wasn't 300 pages of I'm going to scare you on every page. You know, what horror does really well, or when it's most effective, I should say, when horror is most effective, is a book like The Stand, is a movie like Jaws. Jaws is always the movie that I point to as being an absolutely perfect horror story, where you get the rising and falling action. You fall in love with the characters, you care about the characters, and then something scary happens. And then it kind of ebbs, and you learn something new about the characters, and they're following a mystery or going on an adventure, and then something scary happens again. And you get this rising and falling dramatic sense. And then, of course, there's the big payoff, the big confrontation at the end. It is very much like that. Stand By Me, although not traditionally a horror story, there are some really terrifying moments in Stand By Me, or in the original book, The Body, from when they're about to be run over on the train tracks to walking through the swamp and then discovering there are leeches all over their bodies. I mean, that's just, there's a lot of horror in that, and you wouldn't look at The Body or Stand By Me as a horror story per se. So I really love the way that horror pulls at your emotions. Psycho is another really great example. Nobody dies in Psycho until like 45 minutes into that movie. It's a crime story for the first 45 minutes. She's on the run. She's embezzled this money. She finds this hotel, finally thinks she's safe, takes a shower, and boom, there's Anthony Perkins with a knife. And then it becomes a whole different movie. And that's really effective storytelling to me, as opposed to, you know, I'm not a fan of torture porn at all. The Hostel movies are to me just really boring, because it's scene after scene of being grossed out, as opposed to the rising and falling action, the ebb and flow of drama with scary moments interspersed. And I said this earlier, I don't mind being grossed out, but I don't just want to be grossed out. Yeah, I want to see the shark in Jaws pop out of the water, you know, while Chief Brody is shoveling chum into the water. And I want to see what was it, the Kittner kid? Mark, you'd know. Who was the kid on the raft? It was Danny Kittner or something, wasn't it?
Yeah. I don't want to see that Kittner kid spilling out onto the dock.
Right. That's right.
Well, funny note to that, there was a story I saw. Apparently, the woman who played Mrs. Kittner was out somewhere on vacation with her family. They went into a restaurant and they had a sandwich, and it was called like the Kittner or something with the kid's name. And she's like, "What is that?" And then she asked about that, and the word's like, "Oh, it was created by the cook in the back." And you want to maybe comes out, and it turns out it was the kid who played the Kittner kid. They hadn't seen each other for 20 years.
What?
And there was like, oh my God. So yeah, they
Wow.
hadn't seen each other since the movie.
But
and he owned this little restaurant on the shore and made a sandwich after himself.
Oh, that's terrific.
That is awesome. I'd eat Kittner.
You know, you look at Raiders of the Lost Ark as an adventure movie for the most part, but there are a lot of really good scares in Raiders. You know, interspersed throughout that movie, there are some really, really scary moments, and I think it makes Raiders work both as an adventure movie, as a fantasy movie, and as a horror movie.
Yeah, and I think that's a really smart way to look at it, Russell, where you are looking for the substance, and you're really bringing up a lot of instances where horror, the genre horror, interjecting it with these other kind of genre films that would maybe be, you'd think they were something else, but giving them those horror elements, they really seem to turn those movies into real classics. It's the uncomfortableness in Stand By Me when they're getting close to that dead body that really make you feel that this movie is real. And it's the same way with Raiders. It's when you think Indy's really in trouble, or someone is going to be close to dying, or you think you could be there and you're scared and it's dark and that is when those movies really get amped up. And then so to say that, I love how then you think that, would say that when for the slashers, which wouldn't possibly try to like take that one instance that makes those movies good and then have that instant repeated over and over throughout a whole movie, and then in turn possibly not be as good. So yeah, I think that's a great way, and it's definitely a different background than Mark, and it's cool how you guys bring both those backgrounds together to create the work that you've done. And so, John, I hate to keep you just in the corner. I feel like you're the naughty kid who hasn't talked for a while. I didn't mean to do that to you at all.
Nobody puts Bivens in the corner.
Exactly. So I am interested in what your take is on horror. I mean, coming into it and having such a clear background.
Well, for me, and I'm talking in a bit of a broad swath here, but I don't really think I'm talking out of school, that my generation and a bit of the generation ahead of us, the parents would be a little bit more hands-off with the media that we might be able to get our hands on if we looked for it a bit. So, like, the standout times for me is like being 9 years old and with my family watching the Evil Dead 2 on VHS when you could rent VHS. And just tons and tons of stuff like that that build up what, some people call your horror calluses or your horror scars.
Sure.
So you start getting this really thick skin for the horror and stuff, and you start really liking it. And so horror for, the kids that were back in the 80s or people that were back in the 80s then became much more of a prove how tough you are kind of thing. Like, I would go to friends' sleepovers while I was still in grade school, and we would rent Critters and Ghoulies and that kind of stuff, and we watch it as a group together. Okay, and who's the first person, or who's going to end up hiding behind the couch and watching it? I will say, when I watched Evil Dead 2 with my family, I was hiding behind the couch when I watched it. And that ballerina scene with the spinning head still freaks me out. But that helped build up like all those horror calluses and all that kind of stuff that I had. And that was kind of like my leading in. I think that's why I particularly have a love for like the 80s schlock horror and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I do too. I think, where Russell said, I don't mean to just interrupt you, John, and we'll definitely get right back to it. But I think like what Russell said of like, he's not a slasher guy. I am a slasher guy, so it's good to have you here, John, to hear this other side, because it's like I need somebody who still likes those 80s camp and so much blood and needless killing. I still kind of like that kind of stuff too. So I'd love to hear where I am in the same kind of camp as you, John. I remember watching stuff way too early and being way too scared, and then like kind of wanting it, to be scared.
And something that Cult Classic really focused around, and something that I grew up with, Eliot grew up with, and, people in Wisconsin, Chicago, and all that grew up with was the horror hosts and the movies and stuff that they would show at those times. Chicago, still on MeTV, has Svengoolie. Yeah, still.
Svengoolie, baby. Yes, he's the best.
And
I mean, well, heck, I mean, like you're saying, you're saying, I mean, with Wisconsin, it's like we've got, I mean, where Ed Gein was institutionalized is literally 20 minutes from my house.
Yep, and he grew up around La Crosse there, and then moved around, and then had his death row pie with apple pie with cheese on top, which is just disgusting. But I get way too deep into this stuff. But yeah, there was like this horror host thing, and that was kind of part of the growing up experience, was learning how to sneak downstairs and turn on the midnight movie without waking up the parents, so you could watch that and then get back upstairs and go to sleep. That was a big part of like the getting into horror. And then, like Russell, well, my parents, every bookcase in my house seemed to be filled with nothing but Stephen King, like multiple copies of different, different covers of the book were all over the house. And so I was surrounded by that, and it was just, I had a VHS. One of my favorite VHS growing up was actually, you were talking about the Universal Monsters, was the original Creature from the Black Lagoon. And I hit all those notes. And for your blood and gore thing, as all my collaborators find amusing, I am a fully trained butcher. And so my ability to draw very, very gory scenes is from the experience of cutting up pigs' heads and stuff like that. So
Oh man, that's scary. That is scary right there. I mean, now I'm picturing all those clean cuts from all these books you've done, and that's where it came from, right? I mean,
So are we having the pig roast after pandemic?
Samurai swords and like vivisection everywhere. It's
oh, that's great. So, out of all of the horror work that you guys have done, it's clearly a vast and a lot of great things. What is something that you were in? What is some sort of horror piece, like one specific thing that you were inspired by? Or maybe it's not horror. What were you inspired by when you were doing your creation to get into that horror mentality? John, we can start it right back with you if you don't mind.
Yeah, and actually I have a crossover from movies and comics that I'm thinking of, and that is still bringing in Stephen King, but Creepshow, the movie.
Oh, sure.
And I even had the Bernie Wrightson illustrated book that was all the stories in comic form along with it too.
Oh, that's so good.
No, that was available.
Oh, it was, and it was beautiful. And I believe it is still at my parents' house somewhere. So, but between that and the movie was just done in such a creative way where it actually tried to mimic parts of the comic book form. And it's a movie that I can just go back to and watch time and time again. And the stories hit a whole bunch of different notes. You have the weird familial, we're gonna murder each other thing going on. You have my favorite one, which is the Geordie story with Stephen King acting it up like a ham, and the meteor lands and meteor shit everywhere. Sorry, I'm using meteor shit. And then you of course have Leslie Nielsen in like the last serious thing I ever saw him play before he started doing all like the Naked Guns and things like that. And after that, you have roaches everywhere, which just is the icky kind of horror. So in general, like that hit all the notes. And then being able to open a book and see all the Bernie Wrightson illustrations, which was just a perfect compilation to it. Oh, and I forgot about Fluffy, the crate. How could I forget about Fluffy? But yeah, all those were in there, and so that was a major milestone for me, or what I really like looking at. And directed by George Romero, so it has all the horror lineage you could want in it. Bernie Wrightson, George Romero, and Stephen King. For the love of God.
Exactly. Can't go wrong.
There's your trinity right there.
Yeah. Right.
Yep. Exactly. Well, over to you, Mark. What is something that you were inspired by as not being a horror person when you were tasked for doing these this horror art? Where did you find your inspiration?
A lot of it just came from just thinking about how a lot of different guys drew stuff. I mean, for me, like most of like when I was doing the first Ghoul Scouts book, it's mostly all outside. There's almost nothing that's in an interior shot. It all starts with the kids out camping, and it continues as they're running through the town. And it's not till like the last issue that I think I had to draw any sort of interior scenes. So a lot of it was like, okay, I want to make like the creepiest trees I can possibly do. So I was like looking at like, it's like, who does really creepy trees? And I found a couple things, like there was an Action Comics annual that came out in the late 80s at with Batman and Superman, and they're battling vampires, and Art Adams drew it. He draws like some of the best trees there is. And I remember going, ooh, I really like how he did these trees. And then I was digging up some old Swamp Things from right after Bernie Wrightson had left, when Nestor Redondo was doing it. And that guy's like, brushwork was just beyond immaculate. And so kind of it's like, ooh, look at these vines here. Those are really good. And, and it's just seeing like a lot of these artists, how they approach textures. Because for me, it's like I starting out as an inker in comics before I actually started penciling stuff. I was all about just textures and just love of just noodling and all sorts of different textures I could do. So looking at the classic guys who did such great horror stuff like Wrightson, and then Colin and Palmer on Tomb of Dracula, and even looking at some of the old EC horror stuff by Johnny Craig and Kirkstein and all those guys, just seeing them do that. And also too, I'm a big fan of Wally Wood, and I have like this giant artist edition collection of a lot of his sci-fi stuff at EC, and looking at that and seeing how he was doing textures and drawing his monsters and his sci-fi stuff is so inspirational. It's just like, yes, that's how I want to draw that, things with giant eyes and dripping jaws and tentacles and that sort of stuff. So I mean, it's I've tried to play into a lot of that whenever I'm kind of doing the horror, just kind of think of like, how would these guys approach it, and what they're drawing, and really try to take a lot from that to just kind of, be able to set moods and, create really cool looking monsters and, just having fun with it in general. I mean, that was the one thing with when Russell and I did Terra Firma, it starts out kind of as this whole disaster movie, and then we kind of throw all these aspects of other monsters and horror into it as well. So it's like, well, that took a turn, didn't it?
Oh, that's great,
but,
man.
Mark,
I gotta say, you are a true comic guy, huh? I mean, you're pulling out all of these references from you're referencing all of like just the most legendary artists throughout Marvel and DC in horror, and pulling them into your own work, and then remembering these issues throughout the time. I mean, have you been a lifelong Wednesday comic book reader? Or I mean,
yeah, I mean, I think I can remember the first comic I ever got. I think I was probably 4 or 5, and I still have it. It's somewhere. It was a Batman issue, and it was inked by Bernie Wrightson. I can't remember who drew it. If it was Don Newton, maybe, but it was really cool because it was a really cool him being a detective. It was like he was investigating the deaths on this movie set, and it turns out it was like this stunt man who a stunt had gone wrong, and he was getting revenge on all these people. But it was like really cool. It was like in a way a lot like a detective horror story.
Sure.
Very suspenseful, and I remember that as a kid. But yeah, I mean, after that, I was just devouring comics constantly. I mean, just my history of comicdom has been so weird because I grew up out in Portland, Oregon, and as a kid I went to the comic store that Mike Richardson, who started Dark Horse, owned, and I worked there during one summer. I'd be dusting shelves, and I got paid in comics. So when you're 13 years old and you're getting paid in comics for like an entire summer, that was as good as it gets. It's like, ooh, look, that was the time of like, okay, Walt Simonson just started his run on Thor. The Black Suit Spider-Man just started. Secret Wars. Frank Miller and Chris Claremont's Wolverine. I mean, Perez and Wolfman's Titans. I mean, that era was when I was like working in a comic store. So it's just like, give me everything, and that just kind of parlayed into me wanting to become a comic artist. I already like loved doing art as a kid. So it's like, and then going to your first show and meeting creators is like, you mean you get paid to do this? I thought you just were doing it for fun, just because you wanted to,
Oh, wow.
So yeah, so I've been reading comics now then for 45 years, if you think about it. God, I'm old.
No, it's really cool to hear, for sure. So thank you for sharing so much, Mark.
Oh, no problem, man.
Let's bring it over to Russell. What are you inspired by, Russell? I want to hear it.
For horror stories, but really for everything that I write, I'm inspired by the world around me. I'm inspired by the things I see, the things I read about, the things I hear about. And that's even true especially true really for all the horror stories that I've done. The first time I was asked to write a horror story was for Kagemono Flowers and Skulls, which was an Australian horror anthology that a friend of mine, Jason Franks, put together. And Jason knew I was a fan of horror, and he really wanted me to write a short story for this book. And I was really struggling with it because I love the genre so much, but I didn't know what kind of story I could write that would be original, that nobody had done before, that wouldn't just be copying King or Barker or Dean Koontz. And I was actually sitting at a convention bar in Rosemont, Illinois, during an anime convention, with a notebook and thinking about this. And I started asking myself the question, well, what scares me? And at the time, I had a young daughter. She's a teenager now, but my daughter was 2 or 3 at the time. And it occurred to me that something terrible happening to her and me being unable to stop it was the worst thing that I could think of. That's really a father's worst nightmare, is not being able to protect your kids. And that led to the story Daddy's Girl, which is a zombie story about a father and his daughter on the run during a zombie outbreak, and very, very bad things happen. The other horror stories I've done have had kind of similar origins. Mark, if you want to show Survival again. Survival takes place in the Chicago suburbs. There's a Costco where I always said, when the zombies come, and they are coming, when the zombies come, I'm going to this Costco, because not only is it a heavily fortified building filled with all the supplies you need, it's 100 yards away from a Home Depot, which is filled with all the weapons you could possibly need. And that's where you got to go when the zombies come. And that kind of led to me coming up with the story idea of a family during a zombie outbreak who take refuge in a Costco type store, and what happens to them over a very cold Midwestern winter. And we crammed a lot of action into those 16 pages, Mark.
Oh yeah, that was crazy.
but it was very much prompted by reality. My day job, I'm a newspaper reporter, and I'm paid to be observant and to notice those things that are good storytelling elements. And I've got to listen to that inner voice. I've got to listen to that spidey sense. And when the light bulb goes off over my head, pay attention to it, because that's interesting. Another great example of this, although it's not a horror story, it was actually a crime story. I was at the library once, just the local library here in the Chicago suburbs, and it was springtime, the weather was nice, and I saw a man walk through the library wearing a really nice suit, a wool overcoat, and leather gloves. And I couldn't figure out why, in what really was a moderate spring day weather-wise, why was this man dressed like that? Why was he wearing a wool coat and leather gloves? And in a split second, I thought, well, he's a hitman and he's here to kill somebody. And that led to the story, that led to a different story about a middle-aged hitman who's tired of his lot in life. And he doesn't want to be a hitman anymore, but he doesn't know what else he wants to do with his life. And he goes through life wearing leather gloves with a little notebook because he's middle-aged and he's very studious, and he scratches things off hit by hit, scratches them off his to-do list, and goes on to the next hit, goes on to the next assignment. And that was all because I saw this guy who was wearing leather gloves and an overcoat in the library one day. So that's where I get my ideas from. The creators who I'm inspired by, Mark nailed a lot of them. I'll add a few to that list. Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman, to me, are the gods of horror comics. People think of Sandman as a fantasy story, but if you read that first Sandman arc, it's terrifying.
The Corinthian. Yeah,
the
Corinthian scares the crap out of me. I did a commission of the Corinthian for somebody. I'm just like, this dude has teeth in his eyes. It's just wrong.
That first arc, and I'm sure you all have read this. That first arc where Dr. Destiny has got everybody holed up in a diner for 24 hours, and they just do very evil things to each other over a period of 24 hours, and it's a self-contained bottle story. It's the scariest comic I've ever read, but nobody pitched Sandman as a horror comic, but that's exactly what it was. And that you have characters like the Corinthian, that you have Glob and Brute, and a very handsome and debonair Lucifer who is really an SOB. You know, that trip where they go down into hell. There's some scary stuff happening down there. Alan Moore's Swamp Thing to me also is the gold medal of horror comics from the 80s. The stuff that Vertigo was doing, that whole era, Hellblazer, was just brilliant horror. Whether it was the original British creative teams working on it or Brian Azzarello's, I think, vastly underappreciated arc. I think Brian's arc on his 2 arcs on Hellblazer were just really, really brilliant stuff.
Yeah, I know. I agree. I'm a big Hellblazer fan. I bought them all until he went to the normal DC, and then I guess I kind of just dropped off after that. But I love everything about all of those books. Alan Moore, of course, he's the creme de la creme for these books. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing again. That's excellent. But one of the things you said at the very beginning, Russell, that I thought was interesting is you had to, and before I get into this, isn't it really funny how where your inspiration comes from as a writer and where their inspiration comes from as artists, and just how you guys, your brains work a little differently? I like that. But what I was going to say is something that you mentioned, Russell, is you had to put yourself in a perspective of, what would scare you, and that is kind of how you had to draw that out. I would like to give it to John and Mark. I mean, can you guys be scared anymore through storytelling?
Through storytelling? Yeah. I still can. I still have like the jump reflex.
Yes.
And stuff like that. It doesn't hit at me as much on like the page turn and stuff like that, because I think I get analytical on a page turn. Like I'm thinking too much about how I would be making the comic. But I can still be hit with like a jump scare and that kind of stuff, and that they can still get me. Even though I kind of like I play around with people in that world, like special effects people and stuff like that are in the same warehouse as my studio, so I get to see like all these molds of like bodies that are ripped open and all that kind of stuff, and all these like little cosmic monsters. If it's filmed right and the music's right and everything is right for it, you're going to catch me with a jump scare that's just going to like literally push my body up and back. So well, that can still happen. Yeah.
So not fully calloused then.
No. It's not going to give me cardiac arrest, but it is going to make me jump.
John, what's the last thing you read or saw that scared you?
Oh, God. More for just how like heavy the moment was in the movie The Mist, like that last scene where I'm not going to spoil it, but if you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
There's lots of like tiny jump scares in that, but that is actually the most horrible scene in that movie.
Oh, so,
yeah. So sure. I would say that's probably on my list but I mean, it's hard for me because jump scares really aren't lasting. They can hit me plenty, but it doesn't stick in my memory as much, right? It's just like little adrenaline punches. Bam, bam, bam.
The weight of the physical weight of that scene in The Mist is brutal. Just absolutely incredible, and such a human moment too, as the world is going to hell around them, as there are these terrible creatures all over. The thing that is most devastating to the viewer is that very, very human moment. And again, it's a situation of a father not being able to protect his kid. You know, if you watch that movie, and this is so typical of a lot of really good horror, the dad doesn't make a single right decision in that entire movie. Every decision he makes is wrong. And I look at Walking Dead the same way. That nobody just killed Rick early on because he's such a terrible leader. He's an absolutely terrible leader. But he wears a badge and carries a gun and has a cowboy hat, so he looks like authority. But every decision Rick makes in The Walking Dead is wrong, and ruin follows him wherever he goes.
And well, people forget Barney Fife had a hat, a badge, and a gun as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, was it loaded?
Mark, I got my bullet, Carl.
Mark, how about you? What was the last thing that scared you or had that horror impact?
I think for me, most recently would probably be Stranger Things. Mm-hmm. I mean, those first 2 seasons had so much, feel of the 80s horror to it, and just the constant suspense and things going on. You're like going, "What's happening?" You're like, "Oh, geez," Especially, I think, like, a lot of season 2, especially, and a good chunk of season 3. But I think that for me, because I mean, my wife and I'd be watching that, and we'd watch like one episode. And I thought I'd be like, "Well, do you want to watch another?" Because I don't know. We'd watch. It's like, okay, we can't do it anymore. I'm stressed out. I don't know if I'm going to sleep tonight. It's just, it's one of those things that you're just like, oh my god, it's that, like John said, it's that adrenaline rush where you're just like going, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? It's like, and you're like, okay, I'm good. It's like, I'm not going to sleep for a while. I'm just, I'm going to go out and reshingle the roof now. Yeah. But yeah, I think that was probably the last thing. That just really got me. And I mean, as far as I don't really get a chance to read a lot of horror or read in general, as I'm constantly working a regular job and doing comics and things. So, but I think that was a really good example of something that was able to actually scare me and keep me on edge for quite a while.
Sure. So as you guys are all horror creators, is horror a genre that you still seek out? I mean, are you still trying to keep up with horror and horror trends in movies or horror trends in books or comics? Is that something that interests you, or are you kind of removed yourself because you are creating it?
I don't think I'm chasing trends as much as I'm just enjoying media. Mm-hmm. So I actually tend to go to further back to stuff like one of my constants that I'll have running in like the background when I'm working on things are just like compilations of Grindhouse trailers and that kind of stuff. That's because cool. I think that there are kernels of great stories in Grindhouse trailers. They just didn't have the money or means to actually, make them a little bit better. As far as like books and stuff, like Mark, I don't really have much time to read anymore, even though I really enjoy it. So I end up doing audiobooks a lot. And so I have some Ramsey Campbell that I'm going to be listening to, and I'm listening to some classic Lovecraft right now. And just being reminded just how horribly racist and misogynistic he was, even though I love the story still.
It's true. I listened to one of his. You hear everybody in comics, all these creators, they pull from Lovecraft all the time, and I had never read any Lovecraft. I never, so I knew all about him through these other takes on it, and I finally just like sat down and read it, and I was like, what? This is what it's all based on? But no, it is definitely very good. It's just so old and out of the time that
Oh God, yeah. If anyone reads or listens to The Rats in the Walls, they're not going to make it like 2 pages, and they're just going to be like, oh, I can't finish this. This is just this is bad. He's a bad person.
But yeah, he sure had a long-lasting impact on horror, the genre.
Oh, he did. And I play around the cosmic horror sandbox a lot, so I'm all about it. I just don't try to sugarcoat the fact that of what he was.
Yeah,
So.
I like that you. I like that you led with that, John. That's good. That's a good way.
Yeah. It's the teacher in me. I always got to give like the warning at the front of what I'm talking about when it gets a little too sensitive.
I love it. Well, guys, so we are kind of getting closer towards the end of this. So as we kind of wrap up, I would love to have you guys recommend something for our audience, something that something that they should be listening to, something they should be watching, something that they should be reading. It could be from you, it could be from one of your friends, but that is in the horror genre or related to the horror genre in some way, and it could definitely be your guys' own book. But let's just go around the horn, and if I could just kind of hear what you guys would recommend us to be checking out in our media diets.
All right, I'll start off by plugging for my publisher, because my publisher Vault is awesome.
Yes,
there is. I recommend Black Stars Above by Lonnie Nadler and Jenna Shaw. Jenna was actually a teaching assistant for me at MCAD and went on to go ahead and work with Lonnie. And it goes very much into that cosmic horror area. It's a very cool book. And then Vault is also now just about to release another book, another great horror book aside from The Devil's Red Bride from me, which will be coming out, which is called Autumnal, which is drawn by Chris Sheehan. So look for those, buy the trades of the various books, put Autumnal on your pull list. So
excellent. That's great recommendations, and I sure will. Over to you, Russell.
You know, the things that I would really recommend are old school.
Yeah.
I would say the Alan Moore Swamp Thing for sure. Hellblazer, I go back and read regularly, especially Brian's first arc on that, I believe, was called Hard Time. It's when Constantine is in prison, drawn by Corbin. Really, really, really good stuff. And that's something that I go to a lot for inspiration, both for the crime element of it, but also the horror element of it. Of my own books, I will plug once again Kagemono, which was an Australian horror anthology. I'm one of only 2 Americans in the book, and you can find it online at my online store at russell-lissau.square.site. russell-lissau.square.site. And if you're watching this, and if you use the coupon code HORROR, you can save 20% at the store.
There you go, guys. Coupon code HORROR at his website. Make sure that you guys are checking that out and supporting these great artists. All right, over to you, Mark. What do you recommend?
Okay, well, Russell, it was interesting because Russell had brought up with the whole Sandman arc of Brute and Glob, made me think of Jack Kirby's Sandman that he did in the 70s, and that is an awesome. I mean, people think, oh, Jack Kirby, he's all superheroes and some more stuff. It's like he actually, I mean, his version of Sandman was a great little 6-issue horror comic. I mean, there was some creepy stuff in there. So, I mean, if you can find that, that's a good one. Tomb of Dracula at Marvel, they have all I know that the Essential collections, so you can see all that great artwork in black and white. I think a lot of those are available out there. And of course, I will plug my own book, the Ghoul Scouts, which is available through Amazon, Action Lab. If you have a lot of kids in your house who kind of want to start getting into horror, and you feel that some stuff is that they're not quite ready for the more gorier stuff, this is great. All ages. There's action. There's suspense. There's peril. There's humor, and it's a good, nice little I think nice bridge between kids who aren't ready for or just starting to get into comics but want to get into some horror stuff without it being too graphic for them. So it's a nice bridge there. So I will definitely pimp that all day.
I've exhibited next to both of these guys at conventions, and I'll second what Mark is saying about Ghoul Scouts. I've heard Mark pitch it as an all ages Stranger Things. And I think that's very, very true.
We came out before Stranger Things.
It's a great all ages spooky book. It's not horror in the blood and gut sense, but it's spooky. And I think it's a wonderful book for any mid-grade reader that's kind of exploring exploring different genres and exploring horror. It's a great way to get into horror comics.
Oh, excellent.
Oh, thanks, Russ.
Well, guys, I appreciate you all coming here, showing up for SuperCon. SuperCon is a really important to everybody around Sioux Falls, South Dakota. It's our community con. It's what brings us all together. It's completely nonprofit, 100% volunteer run. No one gets any profits from anything that SuperCon does. It's all for the love. And so for you guys to take your time and then come on here and share it with our community here in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, I do really appreciate it, and it means a lot to us. I want to thank everybody for tuning in, who's paying attention and watching. Make sure that if you have any comments, you reach out to these creators. We'll go around and let these guys plug exactly where you can reach out to them at. For any of your questions, leave them here on the SuperCon site as well. I'll see if I can pass along the questions to these guys. But without further ado, to wrap it up here, I really do appreciate everybody tuning in, and thank you guys so much. So if you guys now could just plug where they can find you online and where they could reach out to you on Twitter or different social medias, and then we'll be all finished here.
All right. I am easily findable on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Those are the three main places for social media. I don't have like specific links to give you, but if you want a specific link, I do have my own website at www.john-bivens.com. All right. There's some free comic stuff on there. There is a shop which I need to update, which I will do here shortly. Yeah, go ahead and check that out.
Thank you, John.
You can find me on Facebook at Russell Lissau, and on Twitter and on Instagram at @rlissau. And as I said earlier, you can find my online store, which has a couple dozen books as well as art and other things, which is russell-lissau.square.site.
All right, and I can be found on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram as well. Facebook, I have the Mark Stegbauer Artist of Stuff page. I'm at Mark Stegbauer on Instagram and Twitter. And then I have my website, which is www.steg-art.com. I'm in the middle of trying to kind of update that and be able to sell books through that site, but I'm available to people to order commissions for the show there. And like I said, but things like Ghoul Scouts you can get on Amazon or at Action Lab Entertainment website as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys all three so much, and we'll see you next time at SuperCon, hopefully in person at some point.
Yes.
All right.
Crossing fingers.
That's right. All right. Thanks again for joining.
We'll do this in person.
That would be fun, I think. All right. Well, you guys have a good night. Thank you so much.